Welcome back to the channel, guys. It's your favorite actor, Senpai Reacts, and we going back in time and watching another early n.SSign videos. It was kind of 10 minutes ago. We're watching n.SSign Monologue music video today. If you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, comment below, and subscribe to the channel. We on our way to the top of the world domination. So make sure you like and comment below so YouTube will know that you guys like these videos and then show it to more people, that we can have more people liking n.SSign and everything else. So let's jump straight into the video. How you just gonna start the song off like that? How you just gonna blast me in the face with vocals like that? Like it's just, that's how you feeling? Like you just can I get a warning at least? You just out of nowhere just blast me in the face with vocals. Like Jesus. Okay, we're gonna bring it back. Okay, let's Jesus. My boy is singing his heart out.
봄비처럼 내려와 Stay here 너를 또 불러 내 Take me forever 네가 좋아하던 그 카페 우리가 함께 걷던 길 생각나 영원할 줄만 알던 약속은 Say goodbye 발을 세워 나누던 터 기억하니 사랑스러운 너의 말투 추억의 단편들 잃어버린 장면들 이건 아마 monologue 몸과 마음들이 아파 또 더 나는 상처들 매일 깊어가는 너네.
First of all, the vocals and like their singing voice in this song is I think this might be, besides like memories of us, I think this probably like in my opinion like the best like vocal song I heard from them. I could be wrong, but this is just amazing. Like this is like amazing. Like I don't think I have like this is just like out of this world. Like the singing is just so good.
잔뜩 그린 구름 속 내리는 넌 나일까 비일까 I don't know I can't stop 빈 듯이 아파만 와 Cause you 넌 추억 함께 만들던 너란 감옥 속에 살고파 Stay here I want you all my life come back to me 불을 켜고 밤을 새도록 기억하니 추억들로 두기 싫어 너도 나와 같다면 연기처럼 사라져 이건 아마
He put it all into it. I like this video though. It's like last day of the tour performance in the tour. Or it'd be an outro for the album. This would be really good. Ah, their voice is so good. How are they good at this at singing? Fire song, fire song. If this was like the last day of like the tour and like this is the last performance, I would have been in the crowd crying by this song and not they singing the song. If they were singing this live, like, cause it's like, or especially the way it started off, like they just started off on like 100 and just stuck like the whole song just singing out of their mind. This is really nice. This might be like my third or second. It might be third because I like Funk Jam, then Wormhole. Then this might be my third. Maybe. Let me know in the comment section what your top three, or even if you don't have a top three, just if you do, then let me know in the comment section what's your top three favorite songs from n.SSign. So that was an n.SSign Monologue. Really impressive song. Sad that I finally now watching this video. But I had to go back in time, do a little time travel to get to this video. So if you do, make sure you subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have, and I'll see you guys in the next reaction.